Back with you tonight. Business Unity South Africa is calling for collaboration between government and the private sector in order to achieve South Africa's net zero emission plan. The group says the transition to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions is underway and that they are investing in various technologies, including solar and wind. Joining us now is Busa's Environment and Energy Manager, Happy Khambule. Happy, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. You believe it's underway? I believe they've slammed the brakes on it with the announcement of the Minister of Electricity, who seemingly is not going to prioritize that, but rather prioritize the maintenance of the current fleet of coal power stations.
Thanks for having me. But, you know, we have to consider the fact that the transition, as we say, is underway, but that is a global transition. And the fact that you still need to maintain fossil fuel infrastructure does not mean that you're not actually transitioning or moving towards a particular renewable or a new low carbon economy. The main thing here is that when you have a just transition is that you need to take care of where you are, build the foundation, and then move with all those gains and those goals in mind.
So they were supposed to have given an investment plan at the end of December following COP26 in terms of how they were going to use this just transition money, said to be $8.5 billion. Did they?
Yeah, so South Africa did communicate a just energy transition investment plan, and now what is underway is a broad range of consultations that are speaking to the implementation plan of the investment plan, essentially saying what does it really look like. And in terms of the work that's been done by the task team that is dealing with this, it's been made pretty clear that the 8.5 is just catalytic funding, and really what we need from a range of funding sources and resource mobilization is way beyond $1 trillion rand that will actually give us the kinds of transition that we need. But I mean, the 8.5, as I also just indicated, is just one of the first steps. And even if we do use the 8.5 just for the initial steps, there's going to be a requirement for much more to be done, including not only policies that will incentivize the kinds of actions that we need, but also incentives that will push people in the right direction, like what we have right now with the solar rooftop kind of program.
Yeah, I hear a lot of political parties. I even hear COSATU, Labour, at some point. I hear the EFF I've spoken to. I hear SAFTU I've spoken to. Everybody seems to talk about, yeah, we agree on a just transition because of climate change. We see global warming and so on and so forth. But do we share a common vision as South Africa about the targets that we committed to for 2050 and how we are going to get there?
Well, because you've spoken to everyone, you know that we don't share a common view, but we do have a common document that's supposed to centralize our understanding and give us a point of departure in order for us to have a common view, at least at some point in time, establishing it. We've got a set of documents that, for example, one of them, which is the low emission development strategy, which tells us by 2050 we should be net zero. We've got a document like the IRP that tells us what kind of renewable as well as displacement of coal, what penetration in terms of the electricity mix it should look like. And then we've got broader policy documents similar to the nationally determined contributions, which effectively puts everything together in terms of our climate change contribution and says what we should be doing. So we've got official documents that say which direction of travel we need to go. It also irons out the kinds of steps that we need to do, but individual stakeholders, some of them are not necessarily happy with the way in which either consultation was done or the outcomes of those documents, and therefore don't share the same view in terms of where we need to be. But as we said, everybody agrees that we need to do something, right? And we just need to get to a point where at least some form of consultative or some form of negotiation internally within South Africa actually leads us into having the same mindset and the meeting of the minds on a common goal.
Yeah. Well, there are those who are pushing for the RIP 2019 to be reviewed, and by all accounts, if they put enough pressure, it looks set to be reviewed. Already, that particular document is said to be insufficient in terms of the targets that he has set, well, according to where we want to be by 2050. Chances are now it's going to be reviewed not up, but even lesser than where it is sitting now.
Well, we hope that that's not the case, right? We need to continuously show progression. We need to show that we're not backsliding, that we're not moving backwards. And because we know for a fact that there are opportunities, even in transitions and even in crises, we need to be able to have planning documents, especially integrated planning documents that give us the sense that we're not only being held hostage by our current conditions, but also starting to chart ways and seeing new horizons in where we need to go. Because we know for a fact, and it's a global trend all around, that the new economies are only being developed now, and those who are actually leading in those are going to be the ones who are going to be the front runners of and become the winners. And South Africa's been having this conversation for a long time. So even if we do, and I think we need to be clear about this, is that even if we do review the IRP, any revision of the IRP and updating of the IRP will be based on the fact that we've implemented at least some measure of this IRP that we currently have. Yes, the current IRP is out of date, but it is out of date in the context that it doesn't really reflect the current circumstances, nor does it have an appreciation of the different kinds of technologies that are available. But the actual implementation and the types of technology allocations still need to be done, because we need to build from what we already have done. We need to build from what we've planned and then see ourselves moving on. Just creating new plans for the sake of having new plans to make ourselves feel like we're doing something is not going to work. And we've seen that it doesn't work when we do that.
Yeah. In the context of the current energy crisis, Andre de Ruyter being fired, ostensibly said he resigned, it was amicable, but we know that Andre de Ruyter got fired essentially. And part of what is coming out, for example, from the shareholder is that, well, instead of concentrating on rehabilitating our current coal fleet, he was running around the world learning about renewables. Now, part of the challenge is accelerating the retirement of coal plants. That particular aspect of things, even if the president has announced removing licensing requirements, even if the president has announced the unbundling of ESCOM, that seemingly is going to be where we are going to get stuck, retiring these coal plants. I mean, if you listen to Black Business Council, for example, they are really not for the retiring of these coal plants because they say we need that as base load, at least at this current point, because building a nuclear plant is going to take years. It's not something that's going to happen in the short term. So in the short term, we need those coal plants working and giving us at least 10,000 megawatts.
Well, we have to consider that when we say retire coal plants, whether it's accelerated or within the time scale, there's a reason for that, right? There are a couple of reasons. One is economic, one is technical that we're all facing right now, and the other, it might be environmental or social. And the coal plants that we have, most of them need to retire either in the time scale that they are allocated or need to be retired early because it's either infeasible for us to keep using them because they keep on breaking down. This is where we are. Or it's because we are unable to meet the environmental standards that are associated with using that kind of technology. So it's not really an ideological discussion on whether or not you need to retire them or you need to keep them. It's really that, is it technically feasible for you to keep them? Is it legal for you to keep them, as well as can you actually use them in any respect? If you are able to extend the lifeline of the coal power plants in line with the regulatory environment that you have and the necessary science-based targets that we need to apply, then that would make sense. But if it doesn't, and there's no other way, you need to undertake the program of retiring them and then introducing new technologies as per whatever integrated plan that we may have, whether it's the energy plan or the resource plan. But the issues that you can't, and this is what we need to all be at least on the same page about, is that even if we retire 50% of the coal fleet right now or within the next coming years, we're still going to have coal even after 2050 because Medupi and Kusile are only just being completed or are kind of completed at this point in time. So their lifespan is actually much longer, and they are supercritical. They're supposed to be working at a higher efficiency. So they are seen as something that's going to keep us going for a long time. And even if you do retire some coal plants earlier, you're still going to have some later. You're still going to have some that are still in the system, and you then gradually start to work them out as you introduce new technologies. We don't know what's going to happen in a couple of years. We might have versions of carbon capture and storage that might allow us to use more coal. We might have even other technologies that allow us to use other resources that we can't use right now because, for example, they're just too costly, like nuclear or small modular reactors.
Yeah. So as Business Unity South Africa, do we share the sentiment, for example, that was expressed during the Energy Indaba, that the practicality of our situation right now is that we need to agree that our journey to net zero is not going to be overnight, and maybe might not even be by 2050. It might need to take into consideration the costs and how it's going to impact the consumers and the lives and the economy of South Africa.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why we need the transition, right? So the just transition is not an end point in itself. And I think this is something that has happened in our political discourse and our public platforms, is that people view the just transition as the reason for why we have a need for renewable energy or low carbon development. And that's not the reason. The just transition in itself is designed or is conceptualized as a way to mitigate the unintended consequences and the negative impacts of a decision like retiring your coal fleet early or retiring your coal plants in order for you to put up renewable energy. That's when you start to manage that transition and make sure that there's justice ascribed to it. So if people are rejecting the just transition, is because they're not necessarily understanding the actual conceptual basis of that kind of a terminology or the issue or the process that we need to undertake. But even in all of that, I think we've been clear as Business Unity, and I think even a lot of even the government has also been clear that it is a process and it needs to be managed, because if it is unmanaged, then we're going to have more losers than we do winners. And at this point in time, it's all in our hands. And if we do not implement the necessary considerations that lead us to moving into a just transition, implementing a just transition, we're going to have more and more hardships at the end of the road, even if we have more low carbon technologies and more low carbon economy. But if we don't take people along, we're going to disenfranchise a lot more, and we're not going to actually meet our triple challenge. And that's the key issue here.
What is clear, though, is that the money for this is not going to be coming from African countries, not South Africa in particular. There's a sense and an expectation that, yes, we're talking just transition. In fact, Germany says we're talking just transition, but very little is said about adaptation. We talk a lot about what needs to happen, but we're not really walking the talk in terms of actually putting the money in helping those countries that we are saying must transcend or transform their energy portfolio.
Well, I'd be very happy to have a conversation with the folks from Germany who say that, because African countries have been adapting to climate change for years, even before we actually knew about the inherent responsibility as the developing South to also mitigate to climate change. So when the United Nations Framework Convention was agreed, as well as the Kyoto Protocol, it was largely that the developed world was going to take the lead and it was going to implement, and then developing countries will be given a chance, to move their economies to a higher state or to a higher level of development, and then start to take up these commitments. But now we've got an innate responsibility, an inherent responsibility, due to the fact that it is a universal obligation to mitigate. When we were not mitigating as African countries, when we were not mitigating as the global South, we were adapting, right? And there has been a lot of money, there's been a lot of resources that's been put into adaptation, and there's a lot of resources that actually indicate the cost of adaptation. So it's been critical to African countries, that adaptation that is. And with regards to mitigation, the cost of mitigation must be borne by those who created the problem, and the problem globally is understood to be the global north. Now, because most of us as developing countries and in South Africa, we don't own half of the rights that are associated with these technologies, and some of the capabilities aren't internal. We need to have some form of capacity building. We need some form of sharing, and part of that is going to find money. For example, like the 8.5 billion, which is born out of that context. It's not something that just came out of someone's brain to say, hey, I'm going to go find 8.5 billion. It is because it is couched in the discussions around resource mobilization from the global north to the global south as a result of their own historical need and historical responsibility to provide these resources.
Happy, as always, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on tonight here on In Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Busa's Environment and Energy Manager there, Happy Khambule.